I might actually sit down because I've got all this paper in my hand. Wow, thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm really thrilled to be part of this, to have it come together this evening in my own hometown with these folks who are actually, been working around the world, and they get to bring the message home to us here tonight. I'm Allison Elliott. I'm a board member of the Western Slope Conservation Center, and for most of you, you know that the Conservation Center is 43 years old this year. It's been working long and hard to do good things here in this valley for all of us. And on your behalf, thank you for everybody who's done work for us. This evening, Conservation Center is partnering with Elsewhere Studios and the Learning Council. And one reason we're working with those guys is to spread the word further, that we're doing science and art and the heart, the head and heart, we want to put together tonight, very much so. And there's lots of projects coming up this summer. One is called the Council of All Beings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I want to talk to you just very briefly. There's a bunch of sign-up sheets in the front lobby there, and the one I want you to pay attention to particularly is the CORE Act at the state level, and it's about recreation and preserving and protecting places in our state. And it's we have a sign-up sheet for your support, and so that's one thing I wanted to point you towards. But on to what I really want to talk to folks about tonight is this evening we have Rita Claggett, Don Reeder, Michael Soule, David Inouye, and Robin Smith all on one stage to talk about something that's very close to their hearts. But I'm going to start with a children's book, of all things. Last year I read about this book called Lost Words. Lost Words. And you will understand why I think it's so appropriate for this evening when I read the back cover here. When the most recent edition of the Junior Oxford Dictionary, a widely used dictionary in schools around the world, was published, a sharp-eyed reader soon noticed that around 40 common words concerning nature had been dropped. The words were no longer being used enough by children to merit their place in the dictionary. The list of these words, lost words, included acorn, adder, bluebell, dandelion, fern, heron, kingfisher, newt, otter, and willow. Among the words taking their place were attachment, blog, broadband, bullet point, cut and paste, and voicemail. The news of these substitutions, the outdoor and the natural being displaced by the indoor and the virtual, became seen by many as a powerful sign of the growing gulf between childhood and the natural world. It made me think that we are literally erasing nature. The decline of species diversity is every bit as threatening and as dangerous as climate change. Just as human activity has interrupted the larger cycles of weather patterns, our activities have also interrupted the natural patterns of plants and animals. And that has its consequences. Tonight we will hear why it is important to maintain connectivity, habitat integrity, and biodiversity. I think you can agree that we live in a special place where humans are not dominant. Let us celebrate it and think about ways we can be better neighbors to our non-human neighbors. This event also kicks off the Conservation Center Reports from the Field. That will be a semi-regular series to keep track of our ever-changing ecosystems. It will feature natural resource specialists who will tell us about the current conditions of our wild places and wildlife. We will hear about everything from our resident purple martin population to our aspen forest habitat and an ongoing elk study. And if animals could speak, what would they say to us? WSCC the Learning Council and Elsewhere Studios together will hold a Council of All Beings later this summer. We will tell you more about it at the end of this program and how you can get involved. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Rita Claggett, a naturalist, a writer, and a photographer who has lived in the Valley for about 27 years, and Don Reeder, a professional biologist specializing in land conservation projects, and who has also lived in the area for about 20 years. 27 years, Rita. I'm sorry.
You said that.
Okay, great. And so, take it away, ladies.
Thanks, Allison. I only wish that we lived in a place that humans weren't the dominant species. It's nice to think because we live in such a spacious place that we aren't, but in fact there's nowhere on the planet that we are not the dominant species. So we're going to talk about that tonight, and I just want to introduce our featured speakers. We're going to be plying them with questions that won't necessarily have easy answers. These three men have spent their lives and their careers literally being in love with nature and doing everything they can to protect it. Michael Soule fell in love with nature as a little boy running wild in the canyons around San Diego, and is now widely regarded as the father of conservation biology around the world. David Inouye has spent his career studying wildflowers and pollinators, upon which all life depends, pollinators, in the high country around Gothic, Colorado. And he's been busy this week putting bracelets on hummingbirds around his Paonia home. And Robin Smith recognized early in his love affair with nature that science alone cannot protect nature, and he chose to express his love for nature in a career pursuing environmental policy and planning based on the kind of science done by conservation biologists like Michael and David. And tonight we're going to be asking them some tough questions and one easy one.
Right, we'll start with a gentle question for each of you, which is just to tell us about what brought you to the North Fork Valley. You've traveled for decades and you chose to settle here. So give us a little about your story. Let's start with Michael.
I started coming to this area when I was a graduate student to work up at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Cotton.
Cat here.
Thank you. I began coming to this area, driving through it, on the way to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Gothic when I was a graduate student of Paul Ehrlich's from Stanford. And I fell in love with the place, and I decided to make my home here after I finished my work at the University of California.
A somewhat similar story. I also first came to Colorado as a student to take a couple of classes at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, which is about 8 miles outside Crested Butte. And over the decades, this will be my 49th year working up there, we began to make trips over to the North Fork Valley to enjoy the harvest that this valley is famous for. And my wife and I decided in 2003 that in preparation for retirement from the University of Maryland, that we wanted to have a place here in the North Fork Valley. And so we found a place, bought it in 2003, rented it out until I was able to move out here full time. And now instead of commuting from College Park, Maryland to Gothic, I commute from here over Kepler Pass to Gothic.
Well, I have a much different story. I lived in Ohio my whole life, and during that time, dreamed of coming out to Colorado. I had worked out in the West, working as a park ranger for the National Park Service during the summer, and so when it came time to move, my wife and I were looking for a place that was in the mountains but still had agriculture available, that we could either grow our own food or there were local people who grew organic food for us. And so when we looked around, there really weren't very many agricultural areas in the mountains that we could find. And so we found Paonia, came here and looked at it and thought, wow, this is the place to be. And now that we've been here for 12 years, getting to know the community, I can't imagine being anywhere else.
Thank you, guys. You've been all over the world, and this is where you chose because it's a special place. Michael, what is biodiversity and why should we care?
The word biodiversity is a fancy word for nature. That's all. It's very simple. For all the living organisms around us and all their interactions with each other. That's just, it's a word coined by scientists probably because it sounds scientific.
And why should we care?
Why should we care?
Yes.
Well, I have this bad habit of choking up when I think about nature. I'll try to get over it. We care because we love it, but we care because we're connected to it genetically. We all evolved on this planet from the same organisms. We're all mammals, we're all primates, and we all have in us this innate affection for nature. Well, not everybody. There's some politicians that don't. But they're difficult people.
David, why is the decline in species diversity every bit as threatening as climate change to the planet?
Well, as Michael mentioned, biodiversity essentially refers to nature. I might qualify that a little bit by saying scientists also think about diversity all the way down to the genetic level. So the variation that makes all of us individuals is also characteristic of all living species. Within each species, there's a lot of genetic diversity, and so that's another aspect of biodiversity that Michael didn't touch upon, but you could consider. And so I think one reason we should be concerned about loss of biodiversity also incorporates that whole spectrum of scale. So people who are trying to, who are plant breeders, who are trying to come up with varieties of plants that are resistant to disease, they are reliant upon the genetic diversity, the lowest level of biodiversity within those plant species, and often the wild progeny of those cultivated crops. That's what they have to work with as they're trying to select for resistant or more productive plant species. So that's at one scale. At the other end of the scale, nature and natural systems provide us with a lot of services. Scientists refer to these as ecosystem services, and we don't typically pay for those services. So the fact that we're exhaling carbon dioxide and a lot of that is being taken care of and incorporated into living tissue, that's a service that plants provide, and we don't pay those plants for that service. The oxygen that we breathe is produced by natural ecosystems, and again, we don't pay for that oxygen. So there's this whole host of aspects of natural ecosystems that we depend on, and unfortunately don't perhaps appreciate as well as we should. But because of that host of services that we're dependent upon from natural systems, we have to be just as concerned about loss of biodiversity as we do about the changes that climate change is bringing.
And David, as a follow-on to that question, how much biodiversity have we already lost in western Colorado?
I actually tried to look into that a little bit. There is no list, at least that I could find, of numbers of extinct species in Colorado. Maybe I'll turn that around a little bit and say, well, how much diversity is left? We have over 1,000 different plant species here in Colorado, and so there are a couple of books that are Floras of Colorado, and they're pretty thick because we have so many plant species here in Colorado, some of which are very special, some of which are endangered or threatened. There are 13 plant species in Colorado that are on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, either threatened or endangered list, for instance. There are over 750 vertebrate animals here in Colorado alone, and 18 of those are also on the endangered species list, unfortunately. I do a lot of work with bees. Colorado has just under 1,000 different species of bees, native bees. So when you think about bees, many people think about the introduced honeybees, but we have almost 1,000 species of native bees here in Colorado. Chances are that here in the North Fork Valley alone, we probably have, I would guess off the top of my head, maybe 300 species of bees. And so we know that some of this biodiversity is threatened. We know that some of it has gone extinct, either locally, like grizzly bears. We used to have grizzly bears in Colorado, but there hasn't been one since the 1950s. So that's a local extinction. But fortunately, the grizzly bears and wolves could potentially come back someday because they're not yet globally extinct.
Robin, why should we be concerned about obscure species like some of the native plants that have gone extinct, or other, perhaps amphibians or other kinds of animals?
Well, it's a really good question, because when they're an obscure species, we tend to not think about them. Who cares? We are the superior species on the planet. But as David was saying, a lot of species produce what we call ecosystem services. And one that I think of that for a landlubber like myself is about as obscure as can be is we get much of our oxygen from phytoplankton in the ocean. If they were to go extinct, we would think, well, who cares? I don't even know what a phytoplankton is. Minute little species you'd have to have a microscope to see. And yet we need them to survive because they produce oxygen. Microorganisms decompose and recycle organic material, without which all life on Earth would come to a halt immediately if we didn't have these very obscure microorganisms. And one other area I want to mention are pharmaceuticals. For the modern pharmaceutical industry, plant diversity in particular is chemical diversity, and our plants provide all kinds of medicines, medicinal value for human beings. Right now, about 50% of the medicines that we have in our country are directly derived from plants. And yet, at this point, only 1% of all the plants that we have on the planet have actually been screened to see if they have any medicinal value to us. And so we're about ready to lose these plants before we even know what their value is, which is really not showing much foresight. I want to give a couple examples of some medicinal values of some species that we would think are so obscure that who cares if they go extinct. One is a mold. Who cares about a mold? They're in my bathtub, mold and mildew. Why would I care if they go extinct? Well, there's one that you may be able to tell what good it is because of its name, the penicillium mold, which produces penicillin, discovered in 1928. I wonder how many people in this room have ever taken penicillin. Probably most of us. I would imagine that there are thousands and thousands of people who are alive today, myself included, as a result of having antibiotics like penicillin that have prevented or stopped infections that may have killed us or at least made us better. So this is just really a good example of a really obscure species that no one would think has any value and that we would need to save. How many other species are out there like the penicillin mold that we don't even know of? Look at the Pacific yew tree. Loggers for decades in the Pacific Northwest thought that the Pacific yew tree was a trash tree. It was a weed. And they just wanted to quickly get rid of it so they could get to the more prized trees, the Sitka spruce and the Douglas fir. And then we discovered that the bark and the needles of the Pacific yew tree contained a chemical called Taxol. And Taxol is used for the treatment of ovarian cancer. So we could easily have lost that species, and who would have cared? Another one is the rosy periwinkle, a flower from Madagascar. Again, you know, there's so many flowers on the planet. David could probably tell us the number of flowers that we have. An obscure flower that no one would care about until it was discovered that it produced a chemical that was effective in the treatment of childhood leukemia. And the last one I want to speak to, because it really speaks to me, because I've seen pictures of this, and it's called the gastric brooding frog. This is a frog that was discovered in the 1970s in the rainforest of Australia. And it was discovered that the female of this frog would swallow her fertilized eggs. They would go into her stomach, and those miniature froglets would develop in the stomach. She would periodically vomit them out. They would be outside. She would take them back in, swallow them, go into her stomach. Now stop and think about that. How can a frog live inside a stomach and not be digested by the digestive hydrochloric acid and enzymes that are in all species' stomachs? What good would that be? Well, we have 25 million people in this country who have stomach ulcers. Imagine if we could figure out what chemical those baby frogs were secreting that inhibited the mother's stomach from secreting hydrochloric acid and digesting them and killing those little frogs in the stomach. We could solve that problem and provide relief for people with stomach ulcers. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, when scientists had figured out what these frogs were doing, they went back to find them in the Australian rainforest, and they've never been seen since. So an obscure species of frog that we could say, who cares if it becomes extinct? And it could have had great value to us.
Thank you. David, as a rural area where agriculture is very important, do we have special concerns about biodiversity that may not be as important as in urban areas?
I think one good example of that is pollinators. So North Fork Valley has been famous for many, many decades for its fruit. And in addition to an appropriate climate, what's required to produce a successful crop is pollinators. And so we, in the North Fork Valley, who have fruit trees, and I have several fruit trees, and we depend upon pollinators. There's actually a place in China, which is a fruit growing region, and they had used so many pesticides that they lost all of their bees. And so the people had to go out with little paintbrushes and hand pollinate the apple trees in order to make sure that they got a crop. So you can perhaps imagine here in the North Fork Valley, we'd have full employment. Everybody gets a paintbrush and gets out to climb the cherry trees, the apricot trees, the apples, the pears, the nectarines. But fortunately, we can depend upon wild pollinators, and then there are also some commercial beekeepers in the valley to provide that service. And certainly there are some pollinators in urban areas, but they aren't as dependent upon that natural biodiversity as we are here in the North Fork.
And as a follow-on to that, what can we do here locally to help protect or promote our pollinators?
Well, some of the threats that pollinators face around the world include things like habitat loss. In particular, if you're growing a monoculture, hundreds or thousands of acres of soybeans, soybeans actually do benefit from the activities of pollinators, but where does a pollinator nest? If they're ground nesting bees, they're not going to be able to survive because the ground's getting plowed regularly. Those soybeans are probably being sprayed. When they were germinated, they were coated with neonicotinoid pesticides. And so there are lots of reasons, like loss of habitat, too many insecticides and pesticides, and even climate change that threaten pollinator populations. And so by having the largest concentration of organic farms and orchards in the state of Colorado here in the North Fork Valley, we're helping to conserve those native pollinator populations. Pollinators, in addition to habitat, need resources. And so instead of having one big mass flowering crop, like let's say canola oil, where there are billions of flowers, but they all happen at one time. So what do the pollinators do before the canola flowers or after the canola flowers? You have to have a series of flowers for them to get through the whole season. And so having a diversity of flowers in your yards or in your farms that will provide resources for the pollinators throughout the whole season is another thing that you can do for local pollinator populations.
So we know that, especially given the UN report recently, that habitat loss is really one of the, probably the main problem with species extinction. But climate change plays a role too, and in your research, you've discovered up above Crested Butte that there's a failure of pollinators and wildflowers to be in sync anymore. Can you just give us a brief summary of that? Because that to me is a stunning development.
Well, we found a couple of things through the 45 years of which we've been collecting data about flowering times up at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. One is that the season is trending towards earlier. This is going to be sort of average or maybe a little bit late season because we had so much snow and the flowering didn't start up there until last week. And different species respond differently to the changing climate. So while the spring beauty, the Claytonia, which is always the first thing to bloom once the snow melts, and just started last week, they're very closely tied to the timing of snow melt. The pollinators, like the broad-tailed hummingbirds, started migrating up from Mexico or maybe even as far south as Guatemala probably a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago. They've now gotten this area and they're sort of stuck now. There's too much snow and not enough flowers up in the mountains, so they have to wait here. So their timing of migration when they leave Central America to come up to here is no longer synchronized the way it used to be historically with the timing of flowering. And so we now have shown that on average, the hummingbirds are arriving about a week later relative to the first flowering than they used to. And bumblebee queens spend the winter underground. They have to wait for the temperature, for the snow to melt, for the ground to warm up, and then the bumblebee queens come out, start flying around looking for flowers, starting nests. And at this altitude, bumblebee queens have been out for over a month. And we'll probably start seeing worker bumblebees pretty soon. Up at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, there's still 2 feet of snow, and the queens haven't come out there yet. So as all these different species respond to the changing climate, but respond in somewhat different ways, the timing can lose its synchrony, so that you may have a plant coming into bloom before the hummingbirds get there, or before the bumblebees come out. That's happening now with glacial lilies, which are about the second thing to come into bloom once the snow melts. And there's a researcher from the University of Toronto who's worked for decades on glacial lilies up there, and he's found that the earliest glacial lilies now are starting to flower before the bumblebee queens come out of hibernation. So they're not getting pollinated. So that mismatch in what we call phenology, or the timing of seasonal events, that mismatch is likely to get worse as the climate continues to change. And as a consequence, there are going to have to be a reassortment of different plant pollinator communities if they're going to survive.
May I ask David a question? So David, is this going to be harmful to both the flower and the pollinators, such as the hummingbird?
Most likely, because the flowers need pollinators, and if they're not pollinated, they're not going to be making seeds. Most of the plants at high altitudes are long-lived perennials, so we're not going to see an immediate loss, because even if they're not getting pollinated, those plants are going to be there for decades. But over the decades, as some of them get too old and start to die if they're not being replaced, we'll start to see them disappear. And one of the plants that I work with up there is a very long-lived plant called the monument plant. And I'm a little concerned that over the 30 years or so I've been collecting data for that species, that it does seem to be declining. It's going to be around for a long time because those plants probably live 80 years. But I'm starting to worry about them a little bit. The same with pollinators. If they can't get the resources they need, they're not going to be able to reproduce well. And if that goes on for enough years, they'll start to disappear.
What can I do on my property to encourage biodiversity? And would that have any benefits outside my property?
Well, I gave the example of pollinators. If you plant flowers that pollinators like to visit, you're helping the pollinator population. Those pollinators are not stationary. So if you're helping hummingbirds by planting flowers that hummingbirds like to visit, you're actually helping hummingbirds that are going to be going back down to Mexico, Guatemala, for the winter. And so people down there who may depend on pollinators like hummingbirds to pollinate their flowers are going to be benefiting by what we're doing up here. So this really does become a global issue, a very large landscape issue. Similarly, if you're doing things to promote bee populations, those bees won't stay on your property necessarily. They'll be dispersing. And so your neighbors, your neighboring farmers, your neighboring fruit growers are going to benefit if you're helping produce pollinators on your property. So there is a benefit to a larger scale than just your backyard if you're doing things to help promote pollinators. And the same would be true for all the kinds of biodiversity that you're helping to encourage.
What are some other examples of ways we can protect or promote biodiversity on our own properties and locally that also probably have far-reaching impacts?
One thing you can do is not spray insecticides and pesticides, because we now know that if you go out and sample water in the Midwest, and just about anywhere you sample water, you can't find water that doesn't have pesticides that have run off farmers' fields. It doesn't have chemicals that people have been applying to their farms and have been running off. And so they're starting to see broader problems, including health problems for humans, as a consequence of that widespread use of chemical pesticides and insecticides and fertilizers. And so by restricting or not using those chemicals, you're going to be helping biodiversity not only on your own property, but also anywhere that in your local ecosystem.
Michael, you have a cat that you love very much, but you're not a huge fan of dogs and you're not a huge fan of cats being loose outside. Can you explain why?
Well, there have been studies on the impact of cats on wildlife, and it's tremendous. That outdoor cats, anyway. So there's a big controversy among cat lovers about whether to let the cats go out and hunt, because that's what cats do. Cats are natural predators. So when we let cats outside, they eat mice, they eat lizards, they bring them in the house as a gift for you. They're very kind. And they love us, but we love all of nature, not just their cats. So we have to be very careful about hosting animals like cats and some dogs, I suppose, that can harm nature, because there's an artificial superabundance of cats in our world, because everybody, not everybody, but many homes, many of your homes have cats. So there's a little war going on between cat lovers that keep their cats inside and cat lovers that insist that, well, it's natural for cats to be outside and hunt. What's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is cats kill hundreds of millions of birds in the United States every year. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have a lot of songbirds and a lot of roaming cats around. So we have to compromise. And that's why it's important to understand a little bit about ecology. Trophic cascades is this scientific term, in order to maintain the diversity of animals and plants in our environment.
You have a story about coyotes in a canyon.
When I was a student in San Diego, I became interested in the canyons. The canyons in San Diego are isolated, safe habitats for a lot of creatures. For most of the birds in San Diego County spend some time or were born in canyons, in nests, in shrubs, in canyons. But this is where it sort of gets complicated, and it gets complicated because of coyotes. Coyotes love cats too. They love them in a different way. And so if we want to preserve diversity of birds in the canyons in San Diego and lots of other places in the Midwest too, we have to do something about cats. We have to do something about free-roaming cats. So there's always this war going on now between the cat lovers who want to protect the cats and keep them indoors, and the cat lovers that want to let their cats outside to enjoy nature like we do. So as the world gets bigger and more crowded, there become more conflicts like that. And the job of ecology is to explain these conflicts in a way that helps people understand why so many ecologists want to keep your damn cat inside.
I want to add one note to that cat story, that there's an interesting microbe called toxoplasma that cats who spend a lot of time outside typically acquire. And it can be transferred to humans. So if you have an outside cat and it gets exposed to toxoplasma, they can bring it inside and transfer it to the humans who live in that house. It can cause women to miscarry, is one effect. Another effect is that it gets into the brain of vertebrates. And the reason that it's beneficial for cats to spread toxoplasma among rodents is that rodents become less fearful of cats if they have a toxoplasma infection. And this makes them easier for cats to catch, and then the cats get infected with toxoplasma. And there's some evidence that humans who are infected with toxoplasma also become less fearful. And so if you look at things like traffic accidents, apparently people who have toxoplasma infections are less cautious as drivers, for instance, and more likely to have accidents. So there's some incentive for you to keep your cat indoors.
Maybe we just need a good plan. Well, we'll get to that. Robin, is there a connection between human population and decline in species diversity?
Yes, there is a link, and it's really pretty simple. The more people there are, the more resources we use, the more fossil fuels we burn, the more habitat we destroy, the more we lose our biodiversity. Overpopulation really is the root cause of all of our environmental problems, including climate change and loss of biodiversity. And if we're really going to address these issues and solve them, we must face the fact that there are already more people on the planet than it can support at U.S. levels of consumption. The only way we're ever going to solve the environmental issues before us is if we reduce our human population. Conversely, if we fail to reduce human population, no matter how much time, no matter how much money, no matter how much people power we allocate to trying to solve these problems, it's my opinion we will fail. So there is definitely a link between population, climate change, biodiversity, and that link is the more of us, we take up more space on the planet, there'll be less space for others, and we will continue to be burning fossil fuels and causing climate change.
So you don't think we've already protected enough areas in parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas?
Well, a famous biologist, E.O. Wilson, has said that we need to protect 50% of our landscape for the purpose of preserving biological diversity. You may be surprised to know that in the U.S., we have set aside just 5%, let me back it up, in the lower 48 states, you may be surprised to learn that we've protected just 5% of our land in national parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas, just 5%. That's compared to 16% in Tanzania, 25% in Costa Rica, and New Zealand leads the world, having preserved or protected 30% of their landscape. So just in comparison to some of the other countries who are leading the way, we're way behind. If we look at E.O. Wilson, who suggests that we need to save 50% of our planet for nature, none of the countries are anywhere near where we need to be. So no, we have not protected anywhere near where we need to if we're going to protect our biological diversity.
And Robin, when we say protection, what specifically do we mean? Does that mean humans are not in the places that we are protecting?
I don't think it necessarily means we need to be in the places, because we have people who go to our national wildlife refuges, our national parks, our wilderness areas, but those are about the highest levels of protection that we're going to find in our country. And so if we could just extend protection to larger areas in our country, in fact, you know, if we look at 50%, what E.O. Wilson has said, in the western part of the country, that would actually be a pretty easy thing to do. Because most of the western states, on average, about 50% of the landscape is in public hands, public lands. So we could designate every single acre, and what I would advocate for, every single acre of our public lands not being used for grazing, mining, logging, drilling for oil and gas, but instead for the protection of nature and biological diversity. And to do that, we would need to designate these areas as wilderness areas, wildlife refuges, or national parks.
Won't, let me be the bad guy here. Won't protecting biodiversity by doing all that prevent necessary development and harm the economy?
Yes. It will prevent some developments, some that I would say we don't need or want, and it will put some strain on the economy. Let's put this in perspective though. By the end of this century, there will be no economy, and there will be no civilization as we know it if we don't do something to protect our biological diversity, to stop climate change, and to do that, we have to reduce our population.
Great. Yeah?
Your microphone.
Just to back up what you were saying, I was just reading this book by Bill McKibben called Falter, which I highly recommend. And he documents exactly what you were saying about the consequences of having too much technology, too many people, too much access to dangerous tools like chainsaws and pesticides and so forth.
Warren?
So we've already gone over the line, some people would say, in terms of disturbance, and we've set in motion a series of events that will continue to get worse and will have multiplicative effects. According to Bill McKibben's book called Falter, which goes into details about why everything we say is true.
We've talked in the past about the idea of connectivity. Michael, can you elaborate on the idea of connectivity and wildlife corridors and why those are important in terms of protecting areas?
Well, many studies in the field of biogeography have shown that the size of a protected area will determine the number of species that can live in that protected area. It's called the species area effect. So the smaller the area, the fewer the species can live in it, for a lot of reasons. But if you connect these areas, these protected areas, these national parks and state parks, so that plants and animals, plants don't walk, but animals move them by transporting their seeds, for example. If you don't allow the movement of creatures from one place to another, eventually every place becomes bad for some reason, like a fire, for example, or an earthquake or a tidal wave. And so every place needs to be connected at one time or another to lots of other places in order for the species in it to survive and reproduce effectively over time. So for that reason, again, it's not just enough to have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 protected areas. We need a lot of them, and they need to be protected. And there needs to be movement, possibility of movement of seeds and young, and birds fly from one to another. They have it easy, and a lot of animals don't fly. So connectivity is one of the most important aspects of conservation. But connectivity is being lost because there's so many people and so much industry and so many entrepreneurs that that we keep disturbing and breaching or blocking the movement of creatures across the landscape.
And highways and roads and things like
Yeah,
that.
especially highways and roads.
And what about keystone species? What about large carnivores as important to the connectivity?
The term keystone species comes from obviously the word keystone, which is that stone in the top of an arch, which if you remove that top arch stone, the arch collapses. So a lot of species, not just mammals, not just large animals, but pollinators, for example, can be keystone species. If you remove them from the system, it's not just that species that's lost, it causes a trickle-down effect, causing whole ecosystems to collapse, basically. So not just preserving one area or one kind of species. Every species has a function. It's not that you can't, that the will cannot tolerate a single extinction. Things have been going extinct for millions of years, but those extinctions have been replaced by creatures that have evolved by the process called speciation, which takes a lot of land to happen. So it all comes back to protecting connectivity and diversity so that the richness of our world is maintained. Without that, it collapses.
And I think not just a lot of land, but a lot of time for speciation. And what we're looking at now is the rate of extinctions and the rate of habitat loss, the rate of human-caused changes on the planet. Is the rate of extinction has just increased exponentially from any natural type of extinction event before.
Right, I forgot the numbers exactly, but a new species of vertebrate occurs about once every million years. That's a long time. So if we start losing vertebrate species like birds and mammals and amphibians and reptiles, they're not going to come back. There's not enough time, and human beings are usurping too much of the land for agriculture, for industry, for housing, for transportation. So we are beyond the tipping point, and unless we start to correct that, it will get worse. One of the things that people don't understand is how finely tuned ecosystems are. For example, if there's one person walks through a forest, we don't think, well, that's going to cause much damage. But a lot of animals, including birds, can hear a mile away. And when they hear a person, they know what people are, and they know how dangerous people are. If they hear that person or smell that person, sense that person walking through an area, they'll be, it'll be two miles across that 2 miles in diameter area where they're disturbed and will likely leave if they can. So even when we walk in the forest in the backcountry here, in the mountains, we're causing effects that we're not conscious of. We're not conscious of how it's impacting other animals.
Yeah.
Rita, if I can back up for just a moment. One way that we can protect biological diversity in our local area is if we used our public lands as a biobank. And in doing that, by my proposal of suggesting that our public lands ought to be set aside for the protection of nature, by advocating against oil and gas extraction, for instance, in the local area, and advocating for additional protections to our public lands, we can use the public lands we have around us as biobanks to help preserve biodiversity. And it's going to really take communities across the country to try to protect the local areas to create biobanks to do that. And the best way for us to do that is to advocate for additional protections on our local public lands, and stopping oil and gas is one of the best ways to do that.
Okay. So it's spring, we've had a lot of rain, a lot of moisture. We're all out there right now pulling those non-native mustards out of our yards and our gardens and mowing the white top, and maybe some of us are spraying, but we're all right now trying to deal with minimizing invasive species in our own smaller private landscapes. I have some questions about invasive species, and this is for anyone. At what point, do we need to accept a certain invasive species as the new normal? Maybe there's no answer for that. Is there any point at which an invasive species can become an asset to the ecosystem in which it's invaded? And finally, are we an invasive species ourselves, and how can we become a beneficial species as non-natives? Have at it.
Dave and I were just talking before we started. He spent the day, I think today, pulling an invasive species from his property. I didn't hear which it was.
Goat beard.
Goat beard. And I spent an hour and a half yesterday pulling white top from a field at our property. So I can say personally that I have a hard time accepting invasive species. I don't want to see the planet all become the same. The fact that the different continents all have different species of wild plants and animals is something that the diversity is something that I look forward to having, and I don't want to see the homogenization of our area. So I will always do what I can to try to stop invasive species.
There's a complication here in that a lot of people begin to confuse our hostility to invasive species with hostility to alien human beings, particularly people from south of the border. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about keeping out Mexicans. I just want to make that clear because people, the line between, in many people's minds, between invasive species and non-documented aliens is fuzzy in a lot of people's minds. That's an error. That we're not talking about keeping out Mexicans. We're talking about keeping out weeds that damage non-native, that damage native ecosystems and native species. It's not obvious to everybody that's what we're talking about.
So we'll be opening this up to questions from you guys in just a few minutes. We have a few more questions. Did you want to weigh in on the invasive native question?
I don't think there's any clear-cut, concrete answer to that question. Some of it's philosophical, some of it's personal. I mentioned introduced honeybees. A lot of people see benefits of honeybees, but they can have some negative impacts on native bee species. And so where do you draw the line and say this is beneficial, this is not? If you're a pheasant hunter, you appreciate the fact that pheasants were introduced from Asia to North America because it provides recreation and food. So there's no simple answer to that question.
I just have one more question, and this is for Michael. A lot of us are feeling somewhat hopeless about the state of biodiversity. Can you talk a bit about what I can do, what individuals can do to help save nature?
Well, being informed, reading, it's necessary to be informed, and there's no end to being informed. So if you have an opportunity to talk to a biologist or read scientific journals, that's great, but not everybody can. But there's lots of information online in popular press and magazines like National Geographic, for example, that can help the average person understand the complexity of these issues. I keep thinking about cats as one of those issues. And because a lot of us just love cats, and I'm one of them. But the way to love cats is to keep them inside. But not everybody will agree with that, and I can understand why people want to let the cats free. But if we had anacondas here, we wouldn't want the anacondas running around eating our kids or our dogs.
We had a conversation recently where you said something very, very interesting, that if everyone does what they do best, do what you do best and apply it to saving nature. I'm not saying it as well as you said it.
I think we were talking about that feeling of hopelessness that can come over some of us when we're overwhelmed with all this information and all these ideas and all the tragedies that are happening in the world. And then they ask themselves, well, what can I do? And I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biogeographer. I'm not an ornithologist. What can I do? And the answer is, every profession can do something. Almost every profession, maybe except plumbing. Think about that.
Get the anacondas out of the toilets.
So, but the point is that you don't have to become a naturalist or a biologist to work on these problems. Bookkeepers, salespeople, pharmacists, whatever, farmers, they all have a role to play if they are conscious of these issues that we're talking about. If they know a little bit more about ecology, for example, and care about life. It does come down to love.
That's lovely. I was just going to ask if there's a role for religion or spirituality in the protection of nature. For me, the interconnectedness of all life is a spiritual thing. I know it's not that for everyone, but is there a role in religion or spirituality for the protection? Is there a role for them in the protection of nature? Anyone? David?
I think there is a growing recognition among organized religion that they have a role to play in helping to protect the planet. And as one example, in 2015, Pope Francis issued a papal encyclical letter in which he told Roman Catholics that they need to gain awareness of and to take responsibility for the natural environment. And I think there are a number of other organized religious groups where that have come to the realization that they have a responsibility to care for the planet and are taking some concrete actions to do that. So that I think there is a role for organized religion in that regard.
I'd kind of like to back up and answer the previous question that was kind of gets to the point of hopelessness, and it's very easy to become very discouraged when we see how overwhelmingly bad things can be on the planet. But with regards to protecting biodiversity, the one thing that I keep in mind is that while the populations of plants and animals today are just tiny remnants of what they were 200 years ago, in most cases, those species still exist. And as long as they still exist, there's hope. And that's what keeps me going. The other thing that I wanted to say, and this is actually something that a friend said at lunch on Friday, and I couldn't agree with him more. And he said, if I didn't, even if in a hopeless situation where I knew that things were going bad and I probably couldn't stop them, he said, if I didn't work to, in this case, protect biological diversity, I couldn't live with myself. And so I think that's what gets me up every morning and gets me to get to work and say, what can I do? No matter how bad things they are, I love sports, and so I use sports analogies. If you watched March Madness this year, I think it was either the semifinal or the final game in the NCAA men's basketball tournament. University of Virginia was behind by 5 points with 11 seconds to go in the game, and they won. To me, that tells me that no matter how bad things are, if we put our minds to it, we can still come out on top. And by coming out on top, I mean protecting our planet, preserving biological diversity.
Never give up.
So we have more questions, but if you guys have any questions, this would be a great time. We cannot see you because of these glorious floodlights highlighting our fine features. But if you have a question, actually if I put blinkers on, I can see you. If you have a question for any of these guys, would you like to stand up and ask it? Yes.
Okay.
Back on the left there.
How do you guys feel about dandelions?
How do you feel about dandelions?
They have nasty little roots, but they're so adorable. I mean, remember as children putting them under your chin? You like butter and you see they can take over the bees use them for pollination, so.
I'll say a couple things about dandelions. One is that the scientific name of dandelions is Taraxacum officinale, and there are a number of species of plants that have that species epithet of officinale, and that means that they were on an official list of medicinal plants back when Linnaeus was giving these species names. And so there are health benefits to eating dandelions. We often eat dandelion leaves in our salads in the springtime, for instance. And they can be an important and beneficial resource for native pollinators as well as introduced pollinators like honeybees. They are invasive to some degree, but typically in disturbed areas. So when I typically drive to Crested Butte in the springtime, the cattle ranches, those meadows are often full of dandelions early in the spring. But as I get up the road past the ski area and drive out to Gothic and East River Valley, I don't see so many dandelions because they don't do as well in undisturbed areas. They're very good at, as weeds, at colonizing disturbed areas. So as long as they stay in disturbed areas and provide some benefit to the local pollinator population, I don't care so much about having dandelions in my lawn, for instance.
Yeah, and they are one of the first flowers in the spring and one of the first foods available to those pollinators, native or otherwise. Okay, there was another question right there on the right side.
I'm wondering about pulling white tops, because I try to keep ahead of them, but you drive down the road and you see fields of them, and then I see all these, seeds flying through the air, and I think, is there any use in it? Trying to get them all off of my property?
White top seeds actually are not dispersed the way dandelion seeds are. They don't have any kind of parachute or wing on them. I think I'm correct in saying this. So when they produce seeds, they tend to be dispersed locally, but they can get carried, for instance, by vehicles. So one of my neighbors bulldozed a trail last year or 2 years ago, and that whole trail is full of white top now. And I think what happened is on his bulldozer, he helped spread the seeds. So it is tough to get a head of white top, but I think it can be done.
We have yet to figure out how. Yes, Lorley, is that Lorley?
Yes. I find myself at the Paradise or the Blue Sage at different meetings for environmental causes, and I see the same faces pretty much every time, and I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how to reach beyond the choir.
Great question, how to reach beyond the choir that we are always preaching to. Anyone? Robin? Michael? David?
I always try each summer to write an article for the Crested Butte newspaper or the Gunnison newspaper. I usually send it to both, about some of the research that's going on up at the biological lab, or something that's unusual. If it's a big flowering year for monument plants or a bad year for larkspurs, there are a number of reasons why I think that could be of interest to a broader audience than just scientists. And so I make some effort with regard to my own work to address audiences that are not just scientists and try and get them interested for a variety of reasons. Larkspur flowers kill cattle. If cattle eat too many larkspur flowers, it'll kill them. And so I've tried to let the local rancher know, who runs his cattle in the East River Valley, that I can now predict by sometime in March or April whether it's going to be a good or a bad year for larkspurs the next summer, and whether he's going to have to worry about losing more cattle. And the National Science Foundation actually requires scientists who use your tax dollars for their research, as I'm doing up at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, to try and broaden the impact of our science beyond just publishing in scientific journals. So we now have a mandate from the National Science Foundation to try and broaden the impact of our research. And so I think more and more scientists are seeing that is not only makes sense, but that it's an imperative to try and address a broader audience than they might historically have tried to address. So that's one way in which I think we're trying to broaden the impact of what we know.
Michael?
A lot of scientists think it's beneath their dignity to publish outside of peer-reviewed scientific journals. They think it's beneath their dignity to write a letter to the editor, I think. But it's very important that they do, because they have information that's useful to the public in general. So we have to overcome this inhibition about writing for a more popular medium than our journals.
And Laura Lee, I think, and everyone, I think Michael mentioned letters to the editor. I think that's a really crucial avenue for us as concerned citizens. And also kitchen table conversations and conversations with your neighbors, especially those with whom you don't necessarily share a political point of view, or but you have a lot in common in terms of the values of where we live and what we care about. And so I think it's just really important that we spread the word person to person. We are all interconnected. Species and humans with other species. And I just think it's really important. We're here having a conversation and most of us are on the same page, but it's important to stick our necks out a little bit and have some of these conversations with people that we don't necessarily know if they'll agree with us or not, and just keep sort of inch by inch trying to spread this sort of awareness.
I just wanted to bring up that there's one group of people who are, and there are a lot of them in our county that aren't represented here, children. It's very important that as adults who are informed and who care about the world and nature, bring their children, give their children opportunities to go out in nature. There was a period of time, maybe it's still happening, where there was a time when a child was kidnapped because it was outside. God help it. And so parents stopped letting their kids go outside. It was a pandemic across the country. I hope we're getting over that, but children are very important for passing on this culture of caring about nature. So we must take our children outside and help them to experience and love nature, love the wild.
And take away their electronic devices.
Yeah.
Laura Lee, I think you asked a really, really difficult question that I wish I knew the answer to. Michael had said something earlier about each of us needs to use our own talents in whichever way we can. I'm just going to put in a little plug here because the one thing that I'm doing to try to reach people who may not be the ordinary audience that I would talk to is I've created a slide presentation called Saving Creation, which is about the 6th extinction, which we're currently in. And I'm trying to schedule these at libraries where I'm reaching hopefully an audience is not necessarily the typical environmentalist audience. In fact, if you're free on this Thursday and have nothing to do, go over the hill. I'll be speaking at the Basalt Library at 5:30 this Thursday and giving this presentation, and I'd love to have you come.
Great. Another question right here in the front. Allison?
It's not really a question, but I do want to point out, remind folks that the county is in a master planning process. And in their first part that they've accomplished, they've done the values section. And you can go and look at the master plan as it has been adopted. There is a small section that does talk about wildlife and wildlife corridors. And I'd love to hear more about corridors. And we need to really hold the feet to the fire on that issue. Because as it is written now, everything that it mentions about wildlife also talks about it in a very extractive way, that hunting and fishing and recreation are all these opportunities out there. In our 56% of this county is public lands. And so letters to the editor would be very appropriate. Attending the next section of the planning process in this master plan sequence would be very important. Because there's only a little bit in there that talks about wildlife corridors and a lot that talks about development, which would cut off those corridors if we don't pay attention. And so between the West Elk Wilderness, which fortunately doesn't have any 14ers or any minerals in it, and so it's far less trafficked by the public, that's what we really want to protect and create better corridors to connect it to the wonderful Grand Mesa. So we have that opportunity in our planning process that's happening now in our county. And I encourage you to participate.
Yeah, get involved every step of the way. Yes, in the back.
I want your opinion on how we might get like this. I spent 4 years down in the Amazon jungle and the high Andes walking around and meeting natural people. These are people that never bought anything in their life. They didn't need anything besides their fruits and vegetables they were growing or wild plants. And so they didn't make any trash either. There was no such thing as trash pickup. They lived not in care of nature, but as part of nature. And the kids were great biologists and doctors by the time they were 8 years old, because they got to know all these things about medicinal plants. The tourists were amazed to see these people in the Shuar Nation, for example. So when you look at a view of South America from space at night, you don't see any lights, not at all. But when you see North America and Europe, it's like, and parts of Asia, it's totally different. So I guess my observation is there's an answer in that way of life. And they'd love to participate in fixing our problem, but maybe we need to listen. And how do we do that? How do we become totally sustainable or even better than that?
You know, the UN report that came out last week, you've probably heard of, is a global assessment on biodiversity. And it concluded that about 1 million species are currently threatened with extinction. And it used an interesting word. It said that we need to have transformative change. And I've been asking myself, what is transformative change? And personally, I think that what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, who or what do we love so much that we're willing to make some lifestyle changes for their benefit? Could be your children, could be your grandchildren, could be your love of nature. But I think that we need to make some lifestyle transformative changes, and the only way that's going to happen is through some real introspection.
Introspection and sacrifice, I would say. Yes, front right.
I have a question. You are talking about species to maintain, to keep them, but do you have any idea about what percentage of species we really do not need? We cannot afford them because they are not beneficial to our lifestyle. They're even bad. Is there any statistics available? Because I'm sure there's quite a few species they're not beneficial to our survival on this world.
I think Robin addressed that in part when he gave these examples of what might seem like obscure plants that ended up producing life-saving medicines. And I think part of the problem is that our knowledge about biodiversity and the resource that it can present for human species, we don't have all that knowledge yet. A number of people might think, oh, mosquitoes. Why do we possibly need mosquitoes? They transmit West Nile virus. We've got to get rid of all mosquitoes. But it turns out here in Colorado, we have an orchid that is pollinated by mosquitoes. And so if you wiped out mosquitoes, you're wiping out that orchid species. And that's perhaps one example of something that you don't know about, all those connections. Unfortunately, we sometimes learn about those connections because they're broken when we lose a partner in a relationship like that. But it's partly also a value judgment. So even though we may not know whether or not a species represents a potential resource for the human species, does it have a right to exist? And many people believe that yes, every species has a right to exist. And so there are no species that we can write off that we don't need, that don't have the right to exist.
So you're talking about something like intrinsic or inherent value of species that is separate from the benefit of to the human species, that we're not the be-all and end-all, it's not all about us.
Yeah, and actually economists have tried to figure out an answer to that. And so what they'll do is they'll ask people on the street, how much would it be worth to you to have this species? Maybe you'll never see that species. Maybe you're never going to have a chance to go to Africa and see elephants. But how much is it worth to you to know that there are wild elephants walking the world? And they might say, I'd be willing to pay $50 just to make sure that in my lifetime that people could go out and see elephants or to just know that they're there. And so you can ask questions like that to try and put a dollar figure on what's the value of knowing that that species exists. And so for somebody like an economist for whom it's very important to have a value on everything, that's one way they might arrive at a value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
More questions?
Anyone else? Okay, right front row, right there.
I'm curious about pharmaceuticals in the water, and maybe because I know you worked in the Biological Research Center for so long. Is there signs that there's pharmaceuticals? How high up are they, and how are they affecting living populations?
I'll just repeat in case you didn't hear that. The question is about pharmaceuticals in the water and how are they affecting other populations and how high up are they showing up?
Yeah, they get in there because of their use primarily in agricultural situations. So when you're talking about headwaters that are above places where people would be applying insecticides, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, those areas are relatively pristine. Some of those do get carried by precipitation though, and so there's probably no place in the world where you couldn't detect a number of human-made chemicals like those insecticides, pesticides, fungicides, and so forth. And there's a growing body of scientific literature now looking at what are the consequences of having those in water. How do they affect the development of aquatic insects? How do they affect the fish that are eating those aquatic insects? How are they affecting amphibians like frogs that grow up and live in water? And unfortunately, there are a number of cases now where we know that those compounds are getting into fish. If you're a fisherman, there are some places where you can catch fish, but you're advised not to eat them. And that's because they have, in many cases, acquired significant burdens of those man-made chemicals. In the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, where I used to live in Maryland, people were advised not to eat very many meals a month of striped bass, which live in the Chesapeake Bay. And that's in part because they acquire mercury, being at the top of a food chain. That mercury is getting into the environment mostly from burning coal. And but that mercury then gets spread around the world, And there's probably not a single living organism in the world where you couldn't find trace amounts of mercury from the coal that we burn, and that releases that mercury into the atmosphere. So we're learning, unfortunately, more and more about the consequences of having these chemicals getting into our water supplies.
Okay, second row there in the middle.
It occurred to me that there might be an interesting lesson to disseminate in popular press that could be served as a kind of ecological primer for people to generate ecological awareness of ecosystems. For example, your example about the mosquito and the orchid, you might take something like a mosquito that most people think has no value at all, and then create this chain of interconnectedness about the role that the mosquito plays in an ecosystem that could be of value to us eventually. Or maybe a common weed that most people might think is just a noxious weed and a bother to us from our perspective, but maybe that weed has relationships to other plants and animals that is ultimately important to the ecosystem. So I think most people don't have much sense of ecology.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what the biological lab up in Gothic does is they have a summer day camp for kids. And so every morning about 9 o'clock, the bus arrives and drops off about 30 kids who are going to spend half a day or a whole day there in Gothic learning about ecology. And one of the best ways for a conservation effort to work is to get the kids involved. So I had a colleague at the University of Maryland who did research on golden lion tamarins, which are these squirrel-sized monkeys that live in the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil. Almost all the Atlantic rainforest was cut down. Almost all the monkeys disappeared. And the way they turned the situation around was by getting kids interested in golden lion tamarins. And the kids would go back and tell their parents, we can't cut down the forest on our farm. That's where the golden lion tamarins live. And that kind of education program, starting with children, which then has an effect on the parents, was a great success. So you're right. Getting that information out in ways that's fun and educational for kids is a great way to spread knowledge and have an impact.
I think that's part of the transformative change that Robin mentioned, that we have to get people more aware. Yes,
I you had mentioned that probably the largest part of the problem is the population. When we decrease the population, how do we decrease the population? I think families are smaller than they were 50 or 60 years ago, but we are curing diseases and preventing diseases, and we're living longer. So how do we decrease the population?
Well, first of all, I think we also have to realize that if we don't reduce our population, then what we're saying is we're voting with our actions to continue population growth, which means that we are also voting for perhaps a bad income for the human species. It's likely that if our population continues to grow, well, let me put it this way. I read something interesting the other day that said if you watch a National Geographic special on survival of the fittest, it's quite entertaining. If it's happening to the human species or to you as an individual, it's no longer entertaining. And by continuing to have our population grow, what we're doing is we are saying that we are for increased famine, increased disease, increased malnutrition. And so we really need to decide which way do we want to go. Are we going to voluntarily reduce our population by each of us voluntarily choosing to have smaller families, hopefully 1 or 2 children, maybe you could consider having no children. So we're either going to voluntarily make this decision to reduce our population, or nature's going to do it for us through famine, disease, malnutrition, those types of things. And so I really think that we all need to make a transformative lifestyle change. And I'm not sure how many of us are of childbearing age here in this crowd, but for those who are, I hope that they will ask themselves what's best for them and the planet, and that they will choose to voluntarily have a smaller family, because that's what we need to have.
there's a very strong relationship between education and childbearing. And in studies around the world, including here in the United States, as the level of education in the general population has increased, and particularly among women, the child birth rate has declined. And so anything that we can do to help further education around the world, and particularly of women, increase their educational levels, that seems to have a beneficial effect of helping to reduce birth rates. Here in the United States, our replacement rate is actually below 2 children per, on average, is now, it's about 1.2, is that?
1.7.
1.7 now, whereas 2.0 would be a steady state. So without immigration, our population here in the United States would actually be declining. But this very quickly becomes a very political issue. And so there are a number of organizations that just won't touch this issue of human population. But it becomes a very personal decision at the level of, are you going to have a family of 1 or 2 or 10 kids? When I was teaching, I would lecture to 300 undergraduates 3 times a week. I always gave a lecture during the semester about human population growth. And actually, a couple of women told me later that they'd always wanted to have 6 kids, 8 kids. And they hadn't realized the implications of human population growth. And that as a consequence of learning about the human situation, not only in this country but globally, they were having to rethink that decision. So I got to see the value of how education at a personal level helps people make educated decisions about family growth rates.
There's another aspect to this, and that is it's not just population, it's per capita consumption. Each American consumes, I don't know how many times, you probably know, much energy and material as people in the developing world. So population times consumption equals ecological destruction. It's both.
The U.S. right now has 5% of the world's population and consumes 25% of the world's resources. If we were to supply, if everybody lived at the same standard of living that we did, we would need 5 planets to provide all the natural resources to do so. So we are, in my opinion, the most overpopulated planet on the Earth, because you have to look at something called carrying capacity, which is the number of individuals in a population that an area can support over the long haul without damaging its environment or its habitat. And in looking at carrying capacity on the planet Earth, the higher your standard of living, the fewer number of people the Earth can support. If everybody, again, as I said a second ago, if everybody lived at our standard of living, we would need 5 planets. We don't have 5 planets. And so we drastically need to reduce our consumption of resources as well as reduce our population, and we need to do so as quickly as possible. And those are really difficult issues. I know that personally, one of the things that I struggle with daily is I tell myself I need to buy needs, not wants. Anytime I go to a store, I have to ask myself, do I really need this? We are affluent enough that we can purchase, many of us can purchase most anything we want. And we have to ask ourselves, is this the right thing to do? And I would suggest that if we don't need it, then we shouldn't purchase it. So we really need to take that lesson of buying needs, not wants.
So I think the resounding answer to that question is education, and I have to throw in that sex education and birth control is really would be a massive improvement if that was widespread and we didn't have certain dogmas contributing to ignorance in our human American population. Anyone else? Way in the back, in the middle.
Hi. I recently read Richard Powers' 2018 novel, The Overstory, and in it he imagines a legal system in which attorneys argue for standing for individual species. And I'm wondering if you think that that would be tenable, and if you can imagine that we might reach such a legal context within, say, the next 80 years.
I think there's actually been a movement on behalf of some primate species to show that they should have legal standing. And I don't actually know where that effort stands, but I have heard that there has been some effort to have non-human species granted that kind of legal status. And actually maybe broader than just primates. I'm not quite as familiar with that issue as I should be, but I think it's not in the realm of science fiction. It's something that is actually being seriously considered.
And I actually read some country, maybe it was New Zealand, has protected a river, given it, it seems like it was a river or some kind of non-human organism has given it legal standing. Does anyone remember what that is? But it is, we are beginning to go there. And then there's also the children of the planet who have been filing legal suits to sue the government of the U.S. for depriving them of their rights to a safe future and a fulfilling future. So I think that's another way that, you know, maybe we can pursue and encourage and look towards the legal system for that. But Michael, you mentioned something the other day about about our votes, you know, about our potential. Who we vote for is really important. And
this gets a little tricky, but everything does come down to politics. And when you start talking about politics, it's a problem. I remember when I was growing up, people used to say, don't talk about politics at the dinner table. I think people do talk about politics at the dinner table now, but it is a very touchy issue. And it's hard to know how to cross into that territory. But there's nothing more important than who we vote for. So I hope you remember this conversation we're having here today during the next election.
If I can add to that, I would suggest that we each need to become, and you probably already are, but if you're not, consider it, you need to become what I would call a green voter. You need to scrutinize every candidate for every office and vote only for those that take stands that are the strongest stands on the environment that of all the candidates running. We need to vote as if our life depends upon it, because it does.
that might be a good place to wrap up, but I don't want to silence anyone's voice. Are there any other questions for our panel? All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you all this evening for coming out, both the panels. I thank each and every one of you. And thanks for the audience this evening. I do want to talk about a few things here before we finish. And I want to reiterate, as we were just talking about voting, and we've got to remember that is at every level. This county is not famous for its progressive thought in our politics, and that's why I want to re-emphasize the fact that we are in a planning process, and this is our greatest opportunity to influence far into the future here. This valley has been known for some innovative ideas, and we have been able to succeed in stopping bad idea developments over and over and over again. So I hope that we all can continue in that, in paying attention and bringing some intelligence to our powers that be in this county. And while I'm up here, I want to also invite Carolina up to speak a bit about what's going on later into the summer. This evening we talked about things from the human perspective, but later this summer we want to invite you all to participate in these questions from a very different perspective. And what I'm speaking about is something I mentioned earlier, which is participating in a council of all beings.
Thanks, Allison. What is transformative change? Thank you, Michael and Rita and Dawn and Robin and David for hosting this really powerful event, and thank you everybody for coming out. Many people intellectually realize that we are inseparable from nature. Participating in a council of all beings enables us to deeply experience our connection with nature in our hearts and our bodies. Council participants will become a being or a part of nature and speak on behalf of that being. They will speak on behalf of a mountain, desert, river, juniper tree, honeybee, elk, coyote, or any non-human being that comes to their heart and mind. They will make masks and costumes and embody the being they choose. In the council, the beings will share with the audience the concerns and challenges they are experiencing. Then the council will offer their unique perspectives, support, and encouragement for human beings to act on their behalf in order to preserve life on our planet. There is a ceremonial conclusion and call to action for the audience. This project will be hosted by the Learning Council, Elsewhere Studios, and the Conservation Center. If you all are interested in participating in the Council for All Beings, please go to the table in the lobby and sign up, and more information will be available at the Learning Council website. Thank you all.
That will be happening in early August, and we invite whole families, whole herds of elk, whole schools of fishes, whole stands of aspen. So if you've always wanted to speak from those points of view, what is it like to try to cross a highway in the evening with your whole family, and maybe not all of you make it? So that's something that you can sit with and then come to speak. And we intend to have a scribe there to write it all down and to present it as appropriate to the powers that be on the human end of things. We're here to consider how to be better neighbors, better participants in this whole evolving world that we live in. And we live in a pretty sweet spot. And so it's our responsibility, as we become aware of how precious it is, to see how we can participate in taking care of it. So I really appreciate everybody this evening to come out for not such a warm and fuzzy conversation, but it is in the end, because it's all warm and fuzzy, and that's why we want to be here. So with that, I want to say thank you once again for all the participants and for coming out and stop by and talk with us in the lobby and continue to participate in taking care of this beautiful planet.